You're beautiful together.
My spouse announcing that this meeting is being recorded. Isn't her voice so beautiful? And so welcome everyone. My name is Carmen. I'm the editorial director at Jane, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'd like to start our conversation by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I am in LA, and I believe Amanda is also in LA, the Tongva tribe and their elders past and present. And as we gather in a connected community online, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of North, Central, and South America, Indigenous peoples and their elders past and present. We acknowledge that this naming is not enough for the justice we seek to realize for Indigenous people. Along with this acknowledgement, we also ask, what responsibilities and commitments can we make to foster more honest and generative relations with this land and with each other? And can we, wherever we go, acknowledge Indigenous claims to the land we occupy? I also want to name that today, my highest intention is that our words and our language don't cause harm to anyone joining or to each other. I will hold that intention throughout the conversation, and I will stand in the feedback if I fall short. If there are parts of today's program that are interactive and you don't want to participate and be as involved as your comfort level, time, and attention allow, no is a complete sentence here. And we are recording this session internally for Jane on Demand, but we ask that no one else records this and that it is only shared internally. There will also be time for Q&A. I will let you all know, just so questions don't get lost in the chat. Feel free to drop them in as you have them. And then at the end, I'll let you know when we're getting close to Q&A in case a lot has happened in the chat so that we can make sure that I don't miss them. And with that, so much of what we talk about at Jane is honoring all the paid and unpaid labor that women do, how undervalued our time is, how much space we have to hold for others in our lives, and taking time right now to share her time with our community is no small feat. So I'm honored that Amanda Montell is here. Amanda is a writer, language scholar, creator, and co-host of the comedy cult podcast, Sounds Like a Cult, and author of 2 critically acclaimed books, Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism, which is the book we're going to talk about today. And I am dropping that link for some signed copies from Skylight in the chat. And then she is also the author of Word Slut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language, which was also very lovely. And so thank you so much, Amanda, for being here.
I can't think of a better way to spend my unpaid time and labor.
Yes, that's how it works. And you know, you have, I always like to start with inception stories. You have a fascinating sort of route to this book when it comes to your parents, your decision to become a linguist, and as you say in this book, leave a certain kind of cult that you were in at the time also. And so I would love to just hear, you know, what makes Cultish and the Cult Pod happen in this current moment in time for you?
Sure. Well, I grew up really fascinated by fanatical fringe groups and extreme belief, in large part because of my dad, who spent his teenage years in a pretty notorious cult called Synanon that gained some attention for like the first time in my lifetime in a public forum last year, because there was a memoir of someone who grew up in Synanon that came out called Hollywood Park. But anyway, I grew up on my dad's really like riveting tales of this commune where he was forced to live during his teenage years in the late 60s and early 70s. His father, who was kind of a pseudo-intellectual, an absentee father, kind of a hippie, a card-carrying communist. He wanted in on like the blossoming countercultural movement of the late 60s, early 70s, this era that some people call the Fourth Great Awakening, another peak cult era in the United States, much like now. And so my dad's dad moved my dad and his new like replacement family, stepmom, 2 little toddler-age half-sisters, onto this socialist utopian commune in the Bay Area that bears what we now recognize as many of the red flags of a classic cult-like group. There were incredibly strict rules. At a point, everyone was forced to shave their heads and be reassigned new spouses. Children lived separately from their parents. It started out as sort of like an alternative drug rehabilitation center, and then later grew to accommodate so-called lifestylers, people who just wanted in on this new way of living. And the centerpiece of life in Synanon was this nightly ritual called the Game, which was pitched as group therapy, but was really this incredibly hostile form of social control where people would gather around in a circle and malign one another in an incredibly aggressive and often humiliating way. So my dad, he joined when he was 14 against his will. And he had up until that point grown up in poverty in Spanish Harlem, New York, with his single mother. And he arrived and he was like, this is a cult. Like, that language was probably not in his mind at the time, but he's a skeptical person, you know, an independent thinker. And I talk in the book about, you know, the various things that make people more gullible, more skeptical. It's a really complicated and fascinating combination of nature and nurture. But my dad, he laid low and he escaped the commune every day to attend an outside school, which was totally against the rules. And he went on to become a very successful neuroscientist. So I grew up on my dad's stories of Synanon. And my parents, both my parents are research scientists. And so I was brought up to be a questioner and a skeptic. And also growing up on my dad's stories just, you know, planted the seed of my love of nonfiction storytelling, because his tales were stranger than fiction. So then as I grew up and moved through the world, I sort of saw cultishness everywhere. I should also add that the most interesting part of my dad's stories to me was always this special language that Synanon created in order to do everything that a cultish group needs to do in order to gain and maintain power, to form solidarity, to build a world, to obscure truths, to establish an us versus them dichotomy, to shut down critical thinking, all that stuff. There was a robust lexicon of special Synanon language, and I started hearing notes of sort of Synanon-esque cultish language in so many different areas of my life, from, you know, the media company where I used to work, to the theater program I was in college, to politics, all kinds of places. And so I've come to think of cults along a spectrum. You know, they're not just these communes in the woods where a bunch of brainwashed minions give their life over to a charismatic guru. That's a pretty harmful stereotype. None of us are, in fact, above cultish influence. It's everywhere. And it shows up in the way that we speak every day. So that's kind of what the book is about.
Yes. And I mean, I find it fascinating that it makes a lot of sense once you've read the book. It seems so obvious. And yet you make this argument that language, I think this is a direct quote, language is the means by which all degrees of cult-like influence occur, and that the stakes and consequences of affiliations and the methods used to assert power, creating community, establishing us versus them, aligning values, and ultimately silencing people, have everything to do with language. Not Kool-Aid, not vulnerable, scared people who don't know better, not even turmoil, which plays a part in this, but language. And so I would love if you could walk us through some of those overlapping, or, you know, the types of language that you spotlight in the book, things like love bombing, conditioning, and how they show up not just in, you know, the cults that we think of, not just at Waco, not just in the Sea Org, but in our everyday lives, and how those are being, like, what are some examples that folks can also start noticing in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, so a few things before I address that question. So brainwashing is the explanation that prevailing wisdom and the popular media tends to give for why people wind up in groups that we think of as cults. And I tend to hedge that language and say groups that we think of as cults or cultish groups, because scholars have not been able to agree on one singular hard and fast definition for the word cult. Like there is no standard criteria for what separates a cult from a better accepted religion, from any other kind of social group. Like this stuff is really blurry, really nebulous, really subjective, has a lot to do with cultural normativity, etc. So brainwashing is the explanation that people tend to give for why people end up in groups like NXIVM, Scientology, Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, QAnon, etc. But brainwashing, and this was one of my favorite and earliest discoveries for the book, is just a metaphor. Like it's not a real or scientifically testable phenomenon. And it's often invoked to morally divide us. You know, it's just so easy to say, oh, well, she's brainwashed, or, oh, well, you're mind controlled, you're in a cult, so we can't talk anymore. But what's really going on are, instead of brainwashing, are these really trackable and observable methods of conversion and conditioning and coercion that have a whole lot to do with language. Like as you were saying, and as I say in the book, without language, beliefs cannot be disseminated. I hate that word. Oh my God, like the most phallic word ever, but like beliefs cannot be distributed or propagated or instilled without language. There are no cults. There are no communities that assemble around a collective ideology or idolatry. So you need it. And so in the book, right, I break down like all these different language techniques that cultish leaders, from Jim Jones to Jeff Bezos to SoulCycle instructors, use in order to create their cult-like followings. And these language techniques are not always nefarious, but it's important to be aware of them so that you can sort of unpack them and determine how much of a hold they have on you. So one of my favorite of these cultish language techniques to bring up is the thought terminating cliche. So this was a discovery, or this is something I found early in my research process. This is a term that was coined in the early 1960s by the psychologist named Robert J. Lifton. Thought terminating cliches are these stock expressions that are easily memorized, easily repeated, and they're aimed at shutting down independent thinking or questioning. So let's say you're in any kind of group, whether it's a startup that puts the cult and company culture, WeWork, et cetera, or a spiritual circle, no matter where you are, any group that's legitimate will stand up to scrutiny, will stand up to pushback. But if you find yourself, unable to push back, or when you try to push back, you're met with one of these stock phrases, that's a red flag. So thought terminating cliches, they come in all kinds of different forms and fashions, but they're not exclusive to, right, the Jonestowns and the NXIVMs. They also show up in our everyday lives. So thought terminating cliches that we all are familiar with probably are things like, well, boys will be boys, or well, it's all in God's plan, or everything happens for a reason. And these expressions are really compelling because it's work to think, it's a relief not to have to. And they also alleviate cognitive dissonance, or that really uncomfortable discord that you feel when you hold two conflicting ideas in your mind at the same time. So let's use NXIVM as an example. It's a sort of new age self-help group where there were a lot of rituals and protocols and weirdness that you would want to question, that you would want to push back on. But Keith Raniere, the charismatic leader, many people have a theory that our standards for these white middle-aged male cult leaders' charisma, they're pretty low. So what we call them charismatic, I question what that charisma even is. Anyway, Keith Raniere, if someone were to say like, I don't know, like, why do I have to endure this punishment for this action? Or why is it necessary to wake up at this early hour to do this set of rituals? He might dismiss those valid concerns and anxieties as limiting beliefs. Or he might say, don't let yourself be ruled by fear. And these are also the types of stock expressions that like the QAnon/conspirituality community might use. So the thought terminating cliche is a good one to start with.
I love this. And I have so many follow-up questions. Like you just touched on so many of the things I want to talk about. So now I'm like, which one? But I think something I'm curious about is there's a story in the book where you and your friend choose to go to the Church of Scientology just to see what they will do when you're 19. I openly screamed because when I was 19, me and my friends in DC chose to go to the Church of Scientology there just to see basically how spooky and weird it would be. And your story reminded me so much of mine because there was a very similar almost they resisted us leaving, and I kept asking those questions. And in the story you talk about how you're not sure if your friend is like getting pulled in because she doesn't look as freaked out and doesn't seem as like anxious to leave, and you are the one who's like, I'm asking these questions, we got to get out of here. And like I was like, I want to read the text before I join your religion. And you can buy it for $35 in the language. And I was like, no, like I want to know answers to questions. And they were like, just hold the metal rods and you'll see back into your life in the womb. And I was just like, what? And you talk in the book about system 1 and system 2 thinking, and how our brains are conditioned basically to trust as often as we can so that we don't have to spend as much energy and time thinking, critically thinking about things, right? Like we might know, I trust A and B make C, so C is fine. And when we talk about, there's so many factors, right? Things that happen in your childhood might make you skeptical. Like for you, growing up with a dad who talks about the fact that he was part of a community like this will obviously make you a little fearful and skeptical. And I mean, my own daddy trust issues are my own thing, but what did you find when you were researching these two ways of thinking? How can we sort of hone that system to in a world where cult language it's not only on the rise in what we would consider nefarious, dangerous cults, it's like now something that, which we will also talk more about, capitalism's just like, let's just use cult language now. So how do we hone that response to these sorts of language cliches, for lack of a better word, that cult and cultish groups use to pull you in and keep you
there's so much there. I mean, in this time, particularly as we, increasingly mistrust these institutions that are supposed to provide us with community and support and connection and ritual and meaning, we often wind up turning to like brands and influencers to serve like a pseudo spiritual role in our lives, because we as human beings inherently crave that sort of connection and meaning and ritual. And we want to feel like we're a part of something bigger than ourselves. That's like natural for us. And so our culture has kind of left us sort of existentially high and dry in this moment. So it is important to be aware, not overtly cynical or skeptical. And I talk about the dangers of that, or at least the risks of that toward the end of the book, because I also think it's sort of like against our human nature to be too cynical. It can protect you from getting involved with a dangerous cult, but you also might die alone. And also being too skeptical and too cynical, it stymies joy, it stymies progress. One of my favorite things to learn toward the end of my research process was that some of history's greatest minds in like astrophysics and other fields, when given personality tests, score off the charts in both open-mindedness and conscientiousness. So like Carl Sagan, for example, in the 1970s, was open to the idea that there might be extraterrestrial life when that was considered quite a culty idea, but he was not so open-minded to every cuckoo idea that crossed his desk that he was willing to believe that UFOs had already landed on Earth and were communicating with us. Although now there's this like renewed belief in it. Like you've seen the 60 Minutes. Anyways, love UFOs, or unidentified aerial phenomena as they're called now. Anyways, so it's important to have the ability to let your guard down, to engage in spiritual practices with other people doing the same, because I think that's healthy and I think that's very human. But it's also important to be aware of some of this manipulative language and these methods of conditioning and coercion, because you don't want to be in a situation where an ill-intentioned guru is taking advantage of those profoundly human drives, whether that guru is a scammy spiritual influencer on Instagram, or a psychopath CEO. 1 in 5 CEOs apparently has psychopathic tendencies. Another fun fact. Or another kind of powerful, charismatic guru who's promising to have the answers to life's most urgent problems. Something that I discovered in the book is that it's wise to not to sound too capitalistic about it, but I'm going to use an analogy. It's wise to diversify your social and spiritual and linguistic portfolio, if you will, in life, instead of putting all your eggs in one basket. So because we feel so existentially all on our own in our culture so often, it can be really tempting to want to just like put all of your faith into the hands of someone who's promising answers. But it can actually be really destructive and risky to do that. We are, our identities and our beliefs, they are more complex and deserve more care than, just putting them in the hands of one person. So if you find yourself like reflecting a guru's madness back at them in the form of your language and how you speak, instead of having the ability to like strip off that linguistic uniform at a certain point, that can be kind of a red flag. I think, again, it is healthy to give yourself the freedom to engage in spiritual practices or culty practices or irrational practices, but you need to be able to tap out and return back to grounded reality and start talking like yourself again, instead of finding yourself in this echo chamber. So yeah, I guess that hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, and I mean, it also leads, so just like coming clean here, I am a SoulCycle hoe, which is shouted out in Amanda's book as a cult. And it's funny because you talk about this idea of like the ritual and how almost one of the defining red flags between a benign or good cult, which also is a thing, and like a bad destructive cult, is this ability to hold the space, not live forever in the space, right? So
correct.
you clip in, clip out. And it's funny because every time I was in SoulCycle, like before the pandemic, what I loved about, like, you talk to a lot of people who, when it comes to cult fitness, are basically like, I know what it is, but I also know that that's an experience I want, and I relate, because I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's silly. It's like, I love Ross and I want him to be proud of me. And he's like yelling and inspiring things at me while we're both on the bike. But as soon as class is over, it's like my brain would empty out and I'd be like, what was that amazing thing he said? Like, I'd be on my bike, like, I really hope I remember this inspiring, like, turn of phrase. And then it was like, as soon as I left the studio, I was like, I remember the high, I feel good, but I'm like talking like a normal person. I'm not, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. And it's so important not to be sensational about it and just like claim that everything is a cult in a bad way, because it's not. And also, like, okay, so on this new podcast that I launched as a sort of like companion to the book, my co-host and I have developed these 3 categories along the cult spectrum that we use kind of facetiously, but also sort of seriously, to categorize different cult-like groups and phenomena from the zeitgeist. They're live your life, watch your back, and get the fuck out. And SoulCycle, we did an episode on SoulCycle. I don't know if you listened to it, but we categorized it as a watch your back, because a group like SoulCycle is not going to be like equally dangerous, if you will, like spiritually, for everyone. I kind of think of it, okay, this is another thing that I discovered writing the book, which was very humbling for me, is that you might think to yourself like, oh, I would never end up in a cultish group, or like, I would never give myself fully over to a guru like that. But the techniques and the methods that cultish leaders use to manipulate their followings are very similar, if not exactly the same, to the ones that toxic romantic partners use. And so now I often say that a toxic relationship is just a cult of one. And I don't even mean just like romantic relationships. Like, you can have a toxic relationship with your boss, with a friend, with a SoulCycle instructor. You can have a toxic relationship with a brand, with an influencer, even if it's parasocial. And so like, you kind of need to be aware of your own boundaries, because I think there are some people who are such seekers and who put so much stake in certain brands or in certain group affiliations that it might not actually be healthy for them, even if it is healthy for you. And I think an environment like a SoulCycle class, it can be quite healthy. I mean, we need and crave a space where we can just like surrender to like a group experience. It's just important to know your own boundaries in terms of like how willing you are to give your power over to a certain brand or a certain guru, because if it's SoulCycle, like SoulCycle would love for you to give your whole life to them. You know what I mean? Like they're going for return business.
Yeah, came pretty close before March 2020. And I literally am like, I plan to jump right back in. But, and it makes me think too, like, when you talk about a spectrum of cults and this idea that we are all, first of all, this is something I want to get into with you after this question too, is like, we're all in cults called capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, America. But when we talk about the fact that we are all in cults, we all engage with cultish leaders, whether it's on Instagram or in a spiritual kind of space. And someone in the chat said MLMs. That is also in Amanda's book, which I also wanted to fess up to, that I sold Avon in high school. So there's a second.
Oh, that's a classic. That's a classic.
I sold Mark their MLM teams. And,
yeah.
And I mean, it was fascinating to me too, because that was not I had an experience similar to the person you write about in the book. Like my up chain woman was a family friend. There was absolutely no like, you're going to get kicked out. Like I didn't experience that. Right. So that was very eye-opening. But I'm thinking about two things for you. One is, do we feel like, okay, I can read, let's say, I believe that I am media literate enough that when I read a right-wing website, I can tell if it is garbage or it's just a viewpoint that I don't agree with, right? I can tell the difference because I've been doing journalism for so long, because I feel like I've studied media. I can sort of hear those propaganda dog whistles too, that you hear maybe when you are engaging with cultist language. Do we feel like there is a level of cult literacy that people can build up in a culture where cults language is so widespread? And also, is it okay to openly and willingly belong to a good cult? Maybe it's not even a cult. Maybe it's a community for like-minded, incredible women that gathers in a digital space from around the world together every day. It could be whatever, but is there actually should we be reclaiming cults in some way for those of us who don't want to use them for nefarious purposes? But what's that line between great community organization where we all feel super held and loved and like, yikes.
I don't think there is a line. I don't think we want there to be a line so badly, but like I talk about in the book how there's no like good cult, bad cult binary, because like we're all going to have our different boundaries. And when you're talking about cults as a spectrum, it's like, that's already a lot because it's a lot to process because it's so nuanced. Not to mention like our own background and our own literacy with cults and with scams and that sort of thing is going to determine whether or not like a certain group is healthy for us individually. So it's just about being aware of this stuff and talking about it and being open to have that conversation. And my book is like not the only resource for this. Like, how those two NXIVM dueling docuseries came out like at the same time? There was like The Vow and Seduced. I love them both, but I think that Seduced does a really good job at sort of like breaking down some of those tactics of conditioning and coercion that you can recognize in your daily life. Like it's not just in the NXIVMs of the world. And there are like so many podcasts where, survivors of various cultish scenarios come forward and talk about their experiences. And it's important not to create a divide in your head where it's like, okay, well, we're in a cult, so I don't need to worry. It's like, no, we're all human beings who are seeking community and connection. And I have something to learn from their experience because this is clearly a bright, intelligent, service-oriented person. And a lot of the people I know are, it's interesting, like we have a stereotype of cult followers in our minds. A lot of us do. And all of the cult survivors that I talked to for this book completely shattered that stereotype in my mind. I mean, I talked to a woman who survived Jonestown, which is just wild. Her story, Laura Johnston Cole, for those who've read the book, you'll remember. And so she was very lucky and very privileged, and she evaded the massacre that day. And then she went ahead and joined Synanon, which was the group that where my dad spent his teenage years. So you'd think, oh, this person joined two of the most notorious cults of all time. She must be like bonkers. But she was so grounded and so funny and so whip smart and sharp. She was just like an activist who desperately wanted to believe, because of her idealism and her service, that there was a group that could solve all of the world's most urgent problems and fulfill everything that she wanted out of the world in this way. She was so hopeful that she went and tried to find it twice, and it just, bad luck. She like went from the frying pan into the fire. But she totally defied that stereotype. And so, like, if you're a dreamer, or if you're a seeker, or if you have like a hope that the world can get better, which I hope and I think everyone here probably does, don't stop in that pursuit. Just be aware that there are people out there who might want to take advantage of that dreaminess and optimism. And now I forget the original question, but I think that, seeking community and seeking like-minded others who want to make the world a better place is a good thing. You just can't put all your eggs in that basket, particularly if that basket is being carried by one like very charismatic person, because that's like a recipe for potential destruction.
Totally. And like, just so we're all clear, like Jane is run by so many different people. So, there we are, we're in the clear. But it also, there was me reading the book being like, well, cool, I'm going to keep going to SoulCycle because we're all in cults, and I'm aware of my boundaries here. Yeah. And then there's, and then there was me reading some of these chapters when you talk about the Protestant Reformation movement and all of these voids that you describe cults as a uniquely American phenomena. Obviously, it's not like only America has cults, but this idea that because we have such a fractured and greedy form of governing, we don't have basic services, and our basic needs are not met. So we ultimately, all of us are kind of longing for belonging, connection, and care, maybe more than people whose governments take actual care of them, because our healthcare system is so poor. People turn to cult fitness because they can't find someone who talks about their bodies and their health in a way that is accessible to them. People turn to MLMs because there's a religious void here where religion is so prescribed, but people still are seeking. And you talk about like new age spirituality, all of these things that are so, it was crazy to read the book and to hear you talk about things like gaslighting, confirmation bias, things that for me, when I think about them, it's always like, these are things that hold up white supremacy. These are things that hold up patriarchy. These are things that hold up and are propagated by capitalism. And so it makes me wonder, like, A, do you feel that if the world does get better, do we feel like chicken or egg? Do cults come with, is it possible to have a cult in a world where this domination politic that we have, like, do nefarious cults flower in an environment where people do have equity and sort of aren't in that domination, I don't know, economy, world, social structure? And then also, like, because Word Slut was about sort of women taking back language and recognizing our role in creating language. I loved when you talked about, you seem to have such an intimate relationship with your language, obviously. I think that makes sense. You're a linguist. I think about my gender all the time and sexism all the time, like when I'm at the grocery store. But how do we develop a relationship, especially now that it's almost like such a late capitalist nightmare to read the book and hear like, oh, cults come from capitalism, basically. And now capitalism is using cults to turn us into cult followers of brands, of people. how do we guard our language? Like, how do we
Mm.
build a relationship with our language, which you describe as the first thing we change and the last thing we let go of? How do we get intimate with it and guard it more and keep it safe? And how do we use it to dismantle and deprogram ourselves almost from this cultception mindset that we're all in because of this late capitalist, like late
I
stage
know.
hell?
I mean, just think of like the mantras that we learn from early life to repeat that come so naturally to us, like work hard, play hard, another day, another dollar, like sleep is for the weak. I describe in the book how one day I was in my kitchen, just like spacing out, staring into the void. And I like looked up and saw that every single coffee mug we own has a phrase printed on it, like a yawn is just a silent scream for coffee. I'm just like, we are, to use the metaphor, brainwashed by capitalism to think that this is appropriate, healthy, a given, organic, whatever. So I think, I mean, oh God, it's a complicated question. And I certainly don't claim to have the answers. And if I did, that would be a red flag. No, but, no,
Only Amanda can save us.
yeah, only I can save us. Only I. No. Well, I think that the awareness, and I think again, just making sure that we're not only getting our ideas from one place, like just even with our media consumption and our news consumption, it is so hard to combat confirmation bias. Like this is so innate that not even like our most logical minds are able to push back against it easily. But like algorithms also in the social media age are incentivized to send us down rabbit holes, causing us to believe just more and more extreme versions of what we already believe. And that's just damaging. The other thing is just like, we're not supposed to confront as much information as human beings as we are right now. Like I came across a study recently saying that right now in 2021, the average person living in a Western civilization or developed nation encounters more information in 1 week than someone 100 years ago encountered in their entire lifetime. So like we're just inundated with a lot. And so it makes sense that we want to simplify things, that we just want to believe what we want to believe. We want to look to places that feel comforting to us to give us answers. So I think it's about, like we were saying before, it's all about balance. It's all about this push pull. We need to diversify the sources where we're getting our information, where we're getting our language. When we're too quick to use a certain buzzword or a certain, turn of phrase that causes us to feel superior morally without having to think too hard about why, or that makes us feel a part of a group just by which feels good. We want to feel part of a group, but that might not actually have any significance other than to divide us into an in-group versus an out-group. It's important to question those things, and to always be questioning, always be vigilant, but to also take time not to consume anything. And I need to get better at this because it's just not healthy for our little baby tiny human brains. Like we're not robots, and there's so much pressure to have answers to things these days, because we're living in the age of information. But that's actually the very reason why we are getting so much wrong, and why we are looking toward gurus to give us the answer, because we're not supposed to have all the answers. We're not designed to. It's like none of our business to know the secrets to the universe. You know what I mean?
Yes. And I mean, I found it so fascinating because it makes sense. We think, like you talk about how we shouldn't call people brainwashed, because the honest truth is that cults emerge when people are just like, I need simple answers to these very hard questions, and there's no nuance and there's too much going on. And I'm like, that was the thought I kept having. I was like, this is us all the time. There's literally so much happening that I need to say, okay, I saw a headline here from an outlet I trust. That means that this is what I believe about what's happening here,
Totally.
because like I just don't have the time. But
Yep.
something that I'm going to let Ivy ask her question in a second, but one of my final cues for you would be, we have sat here and talked about other cult leaders, but I was fascinated by the social media chapter in the book, which is the closing section where you talk about Instagram as a cult platform. Um, and the idea that the word use of follower always hit you as
Yeah.
strong, and how we can all probably in our heads right now think of like 5 influencers with no expertise, literally no business doing what they're doing and making millions of dollars from advertisers to do what they do, that we follow. But I think what was interesting was you touched on the fact that basically to succeed on social media is to become a cult leader yourself. And so I'm curious, like, especially as someone who, you know, we follow each other on Instagram. You and I are
Yeah.
both public people who try to like put our work out there and build a personal brand. And like, capitalist hell aside,
Yeah.
how do you negotiate that? How do we almost like, how do we resist that urge to buy into that capitalist capitalizing on cult culture, to say like, oh, wouldn't it be great if everyone's paying attention to you? Isn't that what you want? Like, how do we like break that cycle of, now they're like, well, you can be in a cult, now you can start a cult, then you can have a cult within a cult. Like, how do we
Yeah.
be like, it's enough?
Oh my God. Well, I had my partner put a parental blocker on a few different social media websites for me because it was getting unhealthy. Um, Gosh, this is now like a mental health question,
Right.
or like this is like above my pay grade, I think. I don't know. Like I am totally in the cult of Instagram. And it's really quite disgusting because I am like my own cult leader on Instagram because I don't want to like spill publishing tea, but I'm just like trying to do the most for
Ask
my
of you.
own book. Yeah. And but it's really unhealthy. It's like we're not meant to be so self-focused, and it is so toxic to put our stake in other people, but also like in ourselves. It's quite vile. And I've already like decided that I'm not gonna be on Instagram for like 2 months, like later in the summer, because I just yeah, like I'm just disturbed by like I'm to use this hideous metaphor that I condemn in the book. Like I am drinking my own Kool-Aid at this point, and that's what we all do to some degree on the internet. Yeah, I'm it gives me the heebie-jeebies. So I think it's important to go to therapy and be in nature. I don't know.
Those are acceptable answers. Be in nature, but not at the cult commune.
Yeah, or like just stay there for a weekend and
Yeah,
then go
I totally feel
home.
that. I mean, it's like, we, because of the way capitalism has been like, oh wow, people in cults will do anything, let's use that to sell things to them, which is just, I mean, should anything about capitalism shock me anymore? No, but that, when I was reading it, I kept being like, oh my God, that's like so messed, that, you know, it's like, oh, this abuse really worked, we should replicate that and then encourage other people to replicate it and make them feel like their self-worth is tied up in whether or not they can successfully replicate it, and
Oh,
then we'll see how it happens.
you will come across listicles online that like providing advice in earnest for how to run your company like a cult in order to succeed. Like you will find those listicles, just Google them.
What
It's a little scary, but I think the awareness and just the openness to the idea that like you're not too smart to become susceptible to this sort of thing, like just that awareness. Like I fall into that trap. I'm like, no, I'm such a critical thinker. It's like, no, I'm not. I am just a human being. I'm not a robot. And at a point, we need to just connect with nature and with other humans face to face and have real conversations and stop like looking at the uncanny algorithm versions of ourselves on social media for a while, because
right.
good Lord, it's frightening.
And that also something from Amanda's book is, if you cannot leave something, that is a huge red flag. So saying to yourself, I'm gonna stay unculted by giving myself time and space away from the internet, this business I love, this thing I like to do, if that feels impossible to you, might be a red flag.
Totally.
And now I'm going to open Ivy. If you want to unmute, put your cam on, come on down.
Oh, thank you. I love this so much. It's so incredible. Thank you, Amanda.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question about, like, I feel like there is like this really interesting thing that's happening in the female empowerment, like feminist circles and wellness and cultishness, like the whole Gwyneth Paltrow of it, and her just saying, you just are hating on me because I'm a woman and I'm just speaking my truth, and like women kind of using our very valid feminist fight to hide in very toxic, and I've really, like, what would be your suggestion? I've been having a lot of trouble, like, having real conversations, because I feel like people who are in that and are really passionate about it, they're like, you're attacking feminism, and I'm like, no.
Well, so that's quite cultish too. It's like, as I was saying, anything legitimate will stand up to scrutiny, and it should be okay to express scrutiny. Like, feminism is not perfect. Like, we need to continue questioning it and evolving it, and pushing back against things that we see that aren't okay. But there's a line of toxic positivity that runs through our culture that is very prosperity gospel, new thought, Protestant capitalist derived, and is at its most extreme in like the girl boss boss babe MLM industry, which is sort of like this blown up extreme parody of like the rest of the capitalist marketplace. But yeah, I mean, I think corporations and our like corporation centered culture has they've always commodified feminism and like pseudo feminist language in order to appear empowering, but hide the fact that what's going on is not actually helpful to women. So yeah, I mean, when I hear like overly gendered fauxpiration, it just sends like chills up my spine in the worst way. Girl boss boss babe fempire, fucking what else, like
CEO.
Yeah, CEO. There's nothing like inherently bad about this language. Like, I love I love feminizing language in my private life in certain contexts, but I think that yeah, there's just like a certain dialect of pseudo-feminist fauxpiration that is like quite destructive and distracting from the actual feminist movement, and it's just toxic positivity saying that you cannot push back against it. Yeah, like I know it's challenging because like in the book I do critique the multi-level marketing industry, and I try to be very careful not to critique the women who get involved with it, because it's not their fault that this predatory industry has like targeted them to like do its bidding. So I think you can critique like a movement or an institution without like dragging women in general or like dragging individuals. But I think because we've all been conditioned by Protestant capitalist toxic positivity not to breathe a word of negativity about anything at all, that sometimes gets confused. I don't know what like the solution is necessarily, but I'm here to validate you that just by you saying that, you know, you don't, that you think that like such and such a girl boss influencer is not helpful to women doesn't make you an enemy to feminism.
I would also add, just from my own 2 cents here, is like I couldn't, like, throughout the book we have to reckon with the ways in which almost like cults again are built on a framework that we are all in these cults without even asking, because it's steeped in this nation's history. But things like like white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism are all or nothing games, right? You're either right or wrong. And if you're right all the time. And if you're wrong all the time. And there is no nuance, because to scrutinize these systems would dismantle and topple them because they don't make sense. And
for sure,
it's interesting too, because it's like, that is also a way to say, I'm not putting this in black and white with you. I'm just trying to critique something in a nuanced way, which is actually the foundation of what feminist critical theory and race theory is like, we need to be able to say, because I think, often Amanda talks about this in the book, that often cult leaders are white men, because we are conditioned to believe, like we are conditioned not to be skeptical of white male leaders, to believe what they say, to trust that if they tell us they have a certain credential, they're not lying. These are all things that we're not conditioned to do for anyone else. But I think as times have changed with someone like GP, it becomes this idea of like, this is also someone who leverages their privilege to
for sure. And like we
make mistakes.
Totally. Like to that note, we like accept a certain person in a certain authoritative role when they like fit the description in our minds of like who should be filling that role. So like we've been conditioned by white supremacy and patriarchy to think that those who should be speaking with authority about God and government look like Keith Raniere, and people who should be, and they don't look like Gwyneth Paltrow, but people who should be speaking about how to care for your body and soul and mind look like Gwyneth Paltrow. And so we need to just like undo some of those really destructive expectations for what power and authority looks like in our minds. And exactly like you were saying, there's this, right, like black or white, good, bad binary that we have in our minds because it makes categorizing the world simple. But like, yeah, you can't, I mean, look at the history of like white feminism in the United States. Like suffragettes are like, don't worry, black women, we'll take care of you later. But by you critiquing our movement right now, you're holding us back. And I think that, there are probably thought terminating cliches that they would use to sort of combat that pushback. But that's ultimately quite cultish, and we should always be able to criticize, things like power abuses that we see.
Awesome. Thank you, Ivy, for that question. Does anyone else have any final questions for Amanda? You can put them in the chat and I can read them. If someone wants to like unmute and hop in, that's also totally fine. Let me give you a second or two. I'm like, I have.
Yes. I have a quick question. Hi, Amanda. I'm loving the podcast. Very excited about reading your book. Curious, because I have friends who are in when you said that sometimes you can be in a cult and not be in the cult, and your best friend is in the cult. And I sort of have a situation with a theater that has a very toxic leader, in my opinion. And one of my best friends is like so enmeshed with it. I would just love advice on how do I get my friend out?
Oh my God, it's so challenging. I mean, I can say some things like not to do. Oh, hello. Wow, there's no one too young for this type of cult education. Yeah. Well, okay. So I would say, like, you want to do your best not to alienate your friend, right? Like, not to further push her away. And some things that you might be very tempted to say that like would push her away would be to say like, I think this is a cult. because like as tempting as it is to label it that, it just reads as very judgmental, and nobody's like, it's just not going to land well. So to say things like, you're in a cult, or like, I think you might be a little bit brainwashed, but like, it's just, these things aren't going to be helpful or productive. So I think like anything, and this is not even exclusive to cults, like you just want to keep her in your life. And it's not like she's like your child, right? So it's not like a Catherine Oxenberg, India Oxenberg situation where you're trying to like save her from a sex trafficking scenario, physically like get her out. Like you're just trying to sort of like psychologically pull her away from a group that's like maybe toxic and like too much. So I think you just want to like keep her around and have that sort of like subtle influence on her, like as an outsider, to give her perspective without judging her, and sort of like make her actually. Recently, for a different project, I was speaking to this mis and disinformation expert who specializes in coming up with counter strategies for like dealing specifically with like anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists. And something that she said, which might not be totally relevant here, but that I thought was really interesting, is like, if you try to like use the logic in your brain to tell them why they're wrong, they're going to feel really misunderstood and like you don't even get them. So if like you're quoting like the scientific journal Nature to try to convince an anti-vaxxer that they're wrong, they're just going to think that you're brainwashed and you don't understand where they're coming from because you're quoting a source that they've been conditioned to believe is a big lie. So just like kind of getting on their level and like asking them a lot of questions and like gently posing to them, well, like, what if this? It's so easier said than done though, because like when it's someone close to you, it feels really high stakes and you just want to shake them and be like, stop it. But I think like doing your best, just like keep them around and keep them in your life and make sure you're having that outside influence on them is kind of the best you can do from my point of view. I hope that's helpful.
Emily is saying yes. And yeah, I mean, I think that is like, when I was watching the Scientology doc, I was fascinated by this idea that family members were like, Scientology is a cult, but what ultimately makes Scientologists realize it's a cult? The alien thing. Like getting to that level and having lost all that money and then having a guy be like, and here's a handwritten note about how in the 1950s, like blah, blah, blah. And that's when people start being like, oh,
they have to do their questioning on their own. Like, for example, earlier I made the comparison between cults and toxic relationships. And it's like, you know, not to get too personal about it, but like what I was in like a very toxic one-on-one relationship with like a much older person who had this hold on me. And it's like, my parents could have tried to deprogram me, if you will, but that would have just made me mad. It would have made me feel misunderstood. It would have made me feel controlled. Instead, they just like kept me around and hoped that one day I would figure it out on my own and come safely home to them. And like, that's what I did. And like, do I wish I had come to that realization sooner? Yes. But like, all that matters is that I eventually did, and I'm starting therapy again.
And I mean, if anyone in anyone's life is, you know, in need of community, totally not cultish community activities, could always give them a gift membership to the Club or some other community organizations. And yeah, thank you so much for that question, Emily. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Amanda, for being here. I'm like,
Thanks
we have
for having me.
Officially gone over your hour. I have a link to Amanda's book, signed copies from Skylight. So you are supporting an independent and free-thinking bookstore, as well as supporting Amanda. And I put a link to our post-event survey because you could say nice things about me, even though I don't have all the answers and I'm not a singular leader in your spiritual life. But thank you everyone for being here. Amanda, thank you so much. Your book is amazing. This conversation was amazing. And subscribe to Amanda's podcast. Well, I'm in beige, but I was gonna wear my cult white dress. Someone just commented.
It like looks kind of white. It looks kind of white from here. Like it's in the family.
To, like part the hair. If I had a straightening iron, I could have like gone full Manson girl for you today. Yeah. But the hair is curly, so
there's time yet. There's always time.
It's like I'll see you on Halloween. But yeah, thank you everyone so much, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.